Let's open it up to the wider audience. Are there any questions? We're going to take one or two, and then the president will conclude our gathering with his thoughts. Anyone at all? Paul, Scott, you want to hand the microphone?
Thanks. I want to ask the question I asked last night with a little bit of an introduction. And the question I asked last night was about power. I don't think the Occupy movement is primarily, or let us say fundamentally, about differences in income. It's about differences in power. We have large corporations that are run by a very small group of people, a CEO, board of directors, and these people have power. There's no question about it. And they extract and are able to extract extremely large salaries and rewards for themselves because it doesn't affect the bottom line of a large corporation. It's the fourth, fifth, sixth significant figure. But typically your labor is about 50% of your costs. That can be reduced and is reduced. And so we see this pressure downward. I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, but I really want the panel's reaction to this, that it's really power differences that make the difference. And unless we really address that fundamental issue of differences in power, I think we won't address the issue of differences in wealth, and we won't address the problem.
Any thoughts from the panel? Is it really all about power?
Go ahead.
I tried answering it yesterday, and I don't think I have done a good job. So I'll let you take a shot at it, and then I have something to say.
Okay, well, I guess I am the political scientist on the panel, so I ought to be able to answer it. But let's see if I give satisfaction here. I think that I agree with you that it is about power. But once in a modern capitalist society, the economy does take on a sort of autonomy of its own, so that once you create the structures in which inequality is exacerbated, then it does take on an economic autonomy. But I completely agree with you that it is about power. And I want to say a couple of other things which also relate to some of the things that Robert there was saying. Very briefly, if you remember in the charts that I showed, the basin element, I mean, that was experienced in practically every society around the world in one form or another, that there was a massive flattening of inequality, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and then also great growth. So, I mean, the two went together. That was precisely because the 1940s were a decade of great social mobilization. When Hari first proposed that we should have this panel, immediately, I'm from India originally like Hari, and my immediate thought was to say, it's so interesting in India, in India I grew up in, which is, by the way, no longer when I go back, I do not recognize it in many places. But it was a society in which we didn't call capitalists, we called them industrialists. Now, maybe we were deluding ourselves, I don't know. But there's a definite sense in which there was a sense that the government and the business class was engaged in a larger joint enterprise. And indeed, in the independence movement, there was something called the Bombay Plan, which the industrialists put forward, which was effectively some kind of a plan to increase the size of the domestic market, which would then allow industry to expand, et cetera, and completely envisaging a big role for the state, including state-owned industries, all those things. I mean, one can get, I just want to put that out. So I think it's about power, and I think when you have, so the period that we're talking about, in the West particularly, where you have seen huge amounts of inequality develop over the last 30 years, what did the period begin with? In the two most important English-speaking countries, in the UK and in the United States, they began with a huge war on trade unions. Sorry? It began with a huge war, an attack on trade unions. Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, each in their own way, took on the trade unions and massively reduced union density in their respective countries. Okay, so I mean, I think that I agree, it is about power, but the reason we also talk about the economy is because it takes on then a dynamic of its own, which has a feedback loop, So we're living at the moment in a time where, despite the fact that the people who caused the crisis continue to have so much power in the capitals of the Western world, that not only do they get bailed out, but they get further installments of policies that are throttling the economy while preserving the value of their investments. That is indeed power.
Okay. I think this question that you've raised and the question earlier about businesses doesn't have to do anything, but it's the government. So I'd like to put both of them together and ask you this question, Paul. Where do you think the power is coming from? Where do you think the power is coming from?
I think wealth creates power.
Exactly.
And power
So
creates wealth.
that is exactly
It's
the
the
point.
kind of feedback loop that
Yeah.
you're talking about.
Yes.
That's where it comes from.
So the power is coming from wealth, right? So that is the inequality issue that we're talking about. So if you ask the Occupy protesters, so the way they would talk about this is that the governments cannot do anything because the businesses have power over them because of the money. So that is why it boils down to the inequality, income and wealth inequality. That's the way I look at it. But yes, it could be definitely seen in terms of power, but to a large extent, I think power arises from your ability to create wealth and control it. So that is where the businesses, I think, have a fairly large role to play.
Let's take another question there, please.
My name is Konstantin Stud. I'm a student here at University of Manitoba, and this is what I would like to say. Basically, the discussion today was more about wealth inequality. And the question of the panel, I think, was quite importantly asked, was basically, what should business do? And in my opinion, when we discuss Occupy Wall Street, we should first of all figure out that basically business community just got itself a biggest ally. And it might not be clear right away, but if you think about it, I mean, I'm not talking about entire business community, but small and medium business communities. Because if you think about it, the biggest problem for medium-sized businesses, the one that want to manufacture here, for example, in Canada, is that they cannot actually manufacture here because they have to compete with everybody who is exporting from China. And they have no voice. They have very little weight because they're not big enough to compete on political markets. So now what Occupy Wall Street itself represents is basically an opportunity for the small business and middle business community to point out to the Occupy Wall Street and say, look guys, there's a real problem in society, it's structural, how about you address it, and how about you address it along the lines that basically got outlined by Occupy Wall Street. Because if you look at their demands, and the list of demands is actually available, it's not really about socialism. It's not about greatly redistribution of the wealth in society. It's more about how about we fix our political system, how about we introduce regulation in society, how about we put the criminals, the guys who actually caused this crisis, into jail, and once that is done, we go back to basically free market. And in that sense, since, well, I argue that basically Occupy Wall Street is about free market more than anything else.
Can I ask you the question?
It's basically, no, and my basically question is this. Do you actually see this? Like, I mean, do you actually have a sense that business community should be more engaging the Occupy Wall Street instead of trying to oppose it? And which way can they do it? Thank you.
Should business communities be working with and alongside Occupy as opposed to opposing it? Do we have any thoughts from the panel?
I think they should be definitely engaging with the protesters, and I would once again like to say that they probably might be talking about some of the political reforms or regulations changes, but it is called Occupy Wall Street for a reason, right? So I see a meaning in that. So when they say Occupy Wall Street, they are actually asking the businesses to respond. And if you talk to them again, like we've had an opportunity to talk to them and look at a number of things that they're writing and their websites and all that. Definitely they do say that the businesses have power over the governments. So it is the businesses which probably should respond if we need to see any change.
I'm going to take one more question. I think Cam's hand was up earlier. Last question from Cam.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on some of Radhika's comments, some of the stuff that Robert was talking about as well. Radhika, you were telling us that the 50s, 60s, and 70s were kind of the golden age of equality, at least in relative terms. I've heard a couple of other historians refer to that same period as the golden age of labor unions, that unions were particularly strong then, and also the golden age, or the dark age, depending on your perspective, of labor action and strike action and things like that. And the labor economists or the labor historians typically will make the connection between the two and say that it was the strong labor unions that resulted in that level of equality. So I guess the question that I have would be, is there a role for increased labor union movement or activity in the future to try and solve this inequality problem?
Radhika, would you like to speak to that?
Quickly, I'm really glad for that question, because I felt that I didn't make a more fundamental point that I should have made earlier, so it gives me an opportunity to make it. First of all, I just want to say that not only do not only do I think unions do have a very important role to play, but they will actually, first of all, in the first instance, have to expand. And there they will have to expand into new sectors which have, for whatever reason, not been covered, and therefore all sorts of temporary labor, not well protected labor, service sector labor, etc. They'll have to expand as well as, of course, play a bigger role. And I think that the best way to think about this whole process and the place of unions, business, everybody in it is, or one of the good ways of thinking about it is to think about Karl Polanyi's idea of the double movement, which very simply goes like this. He basically argued that market societies were impossible. That is to say, it was impossible to have a society that was completely regulated only by the market, completely and exclusively regulated by the market, and that historically what we witnessed was that it was a double movement, which as market societies spread around the world, they also gave rise to what he called a countervailing movement of social protection. Now this movement can take many forms. It can take the form of unions, it can take the form of cooperatives, etc., but very, very importantly, it hinged on the state. The state was the thing that engaged in three forms of protection: protecting labor, protecting the environment, and oddly enough, protecting business itself from itself. So in all these three ways, so labor, capital, and land, so to speak, were all three protected. And I think that's very important. Now, I think that certainly at this point, we're living at a time when the market movement has gone too far, and the countervailing movement has not caught up. So I think definitely that would have to happen. And finally, and the fundamental point I wanted to make is that basically, to go back to Polanyi, the dominant ideology of a modern capitalist society is that the economy is a separate private sector, and then there is a public sector. But reality, to go back to the question of power, the real crux of the power is precisely that modern capitalist states permit, in fact create, the so-called private sector and franchise out a number of important political functions to it. So for example, it says, if you're an entrepreneur, what happens within, in a pure capitalist society, what happens within your factory is not our business. Of course, it has taken years of campaigning by unions and other agitators and whatever to say, no, it is public business. Unions should be allowed to organize, vulnerable sectors should be protected, etc., etc. And precisely it is, so in a sense, if you simply say, well, the private sector is the private sector, then that is when capital has the greatest power. And historically what has happened is that movements of people, unions and other movements have organized to demand more. And they have usually got it because actually at the end of the day, purely market or purely capitalist societies have never existed. And if they ever do, then that will be the self-destruction of human society.
Thank you very much.